I've been reading the book Your Strategy Needs a Strategy by the Boston Consulting Group team, and I wanted to go over when your business needs a classical strategy. So the classical strategy goes by a lot of different names, but it's for large companies that's industry is both predictable and whose industry is not subject to a lot of change. So it's a large industry where, and this is generally an industry that's going to be subject to the rule of three, meaning there's going to be three main competitors owning 40 to 70% of the market share, and then maybe some sub players occupying certain niches. So if that's the case, you can adapt, or you can use the classical approach to strategy, and that's going to be known by a lot of different names, whether it's Michael Porter's Five Forces, or Bruce Henderson from the Boston Consulting Group's experience curve. But the basic idea is that you are going to need to leverage your size to drive down cost and pass along value to customers in order to gain market share. So that's going to be a something that you're going to need to strategize each year. This is, and this is actually typically when people think of business strategy, they are thinking of the classical model. And that's actually what we're going through right now, where we're doing our budgets as well as our strategy for essentially all of 2021, because we're in an industry that we can apply a classical strategy to. But you are going to need to see where your industry is, what your place in that industry is, and act accordingly. If you're the number one player, you're going to have a decided cost advantage, and you're going to have to use that cost advantage in order to try and maintain your market share. If you're the number two player or the number three player, you're not going to have as big a cost advantage as the number one player. Pepsi doesn't have as big a cost advantage as Coke, and they have to adapt with more marketing, they have to adapt with more innovation, and a number one player doesn't have to as much. So in a classical strategy, one of the things that you're going to need one way or another is a lot of information about your market, and consequently what the market is doing and where your place is in it. You're going to need market share information, how your competitors are doing, what new things your competitors are doing. These are all things that you're going to have to identify in order to make sure that you are able to effectively strategize about what your approach is going to be. What should your pricing be? What should your supply chain look like? What are new innovations that you should at least consider doing? But the classical strategy is going to be highly focused on scale as well as market share. So again, driving down your pricing, passing some of that value along to your customers in exchange for market share. You're going to have to pay a lot of attention to your margins, manage that very effectively through P&L reviews so that you don't accidentally experience inefficiency creep in your business. So that's the classical approach to business. Some examples that the book gives would be like Mahindra was a good example, the Indian heavy equipment manufacturer. And what I thought was interesting is in some of their areas, they're the market leader, like in tractors, and they just adapt a scale approach and they try and drive down prices. Where they're not the market leader, they try and pick some subspecialty where they can be the market leader. So, there may be something where, like cars, for instance, they're not necessarily the market leader, but they can occupy certain sub niches where they can drive efficiency and get some good cost scale in those sub markets. And by doing that, they can be the leader in that sub market. So whenever you look at that rule of three, which again is that markets tend to gravitate towards three leaders who are going to own between 40 and 70% of the market, you got to define what that market is. And maybe you can't do the market at large, but there's a certain subsegment of the market. Maybe it's smaller customers. Maybe it's customers in a certain sector within that market. But there are always going to be sub-markets within markets that you can attack and still apply classical strategy. That being said, classical strategy, like I said, is sometimes what people think of when they think of strategy. And what the book says is that's often not the case. So remember that, classical strategy is where your market is predictable and you can't really change it. So those are the two, the Y and the X axis in this. How predictable the market is and how changeable it is. If you've got a very unpredictable market that you can't change, the book says you're going to focus on an adaptive strategy, which I'll talk about subsequently. If it's a market where you can change things, but it's pretty predictable, then an innovative approach, kind of like Apple and Steve Jobs. And then if a market is both unpredictable, but you can change it, that's a shapeable approach. So the book is really interesting, goes into a lot. I think it's important to start with the classical approach to strategy, but also realizing that there are a number of other approaches, and you've got to do an honest assessment of your market and your company to figure out which approach is going to be correct for you.